I got similar feedback. The feedback I got was, your blogs are so cool. Your book is so pretentious. Why don't you just write your book in the way you write the blog? Right? So we started from scratch.
Super excited to have Tendayi here. You put out 3 books, all in corporate strategy innovation. They've obviously worked. It's amazing how well reviewed they are. You've got a 4.7 on all 3 books, which is ridiculous. And you're doing this alongside having a family, a full career. You're definitely writing these books on the side. How in the world did you do this? What's your process? How have you been so prolific? And how have you written books that people seem to love so much?
So it's interesting, right? Because I didn't ever think that I'd write books. I thought that I'd just be like a really cool blogger. I just thought like I would live life and share my thoughts of what I was going through day to day. And so I stumbled into book writing almost like by accident. So my books are like, except the Lean Product Lifecycle, which is more like a practical how to implement a process book. But my other 2 books, The Corporate Startup, and particularly my latest one, Pirates in the Navy, those are my Scars Are Beautiful books. So they're really about everything that I've seen and done wrong, fixed, and then figured out how to do it right. And so they're really almost like opening my heart and just saying, listen, these are the things that I've seen work. I've lived these things, and that's how I write. And then after that, it's just then the discipline.
What does that look like? What's your process? Where do you fit this into your life? Because it's hard. I mean, I'm just sitting in the mountains writing and I still find it hard.
I wish I could sit in the mountains, but I got to get my kids ready for school. I developed the habit of waking up like 5 o'clock in the morning was my start time for all 3 books, and then writing for 2 hours until 7 a.m. And then as the family wakes up, you sort of just join life. And of course, then I also had to make a living. So I was working in these companies and giving advice. So I just didn't end up being able to work because I used to try and like carve out a time in the middle of the day to write. But there's so many little things that come at you while you're working. Like my wife just was sending me messages right now about how my son, who threw up this morning, is no longer allowed to be at school for 48 hours. And she was really annoyed by that. She's like, it's just gotten back and now he has to be home for another 2 days. So that's like already, I'm distracted now. There's no chance that I'm going to write anything useful. So I found that the mornings are like the freshest, nicest time for me to write. Nobody's up, everything is quiet.
I'm exactly the same. I find that if I've checked my email, I won't be doing any writing for that day. Basically, once the drama of the day is in my head, it's just over.
Yeah. When I wrote my first book, A Corporate Startup, I did do 2 weekends where I booked myself into a hotel in London and just woke up in the morning and wrote all day, and then woke up on Sunday and wrote all day, and then went home. And then I did it again, right? So that was because I needed to finish. It was now getting sort of dragging on. And we had done this like crowdfunding campaign, and now all the people who had pre-ordered were like sending me all these messages going, where's the book? I paid you the book for 9 months ago. Where's the book? So I knew I needed to finish. That was the one thing that I've done to try and create space. But outside of that, it's waking up early in the morning.
And what about the actual book as products? We were just talking to Jeff Godelf the other week, and he was talking about what a big investment writing a book is. And he was saying, you don't want to commit this many hundreds of hours unless you know what it's for. How do you think about that? And also, do you have any views on why so many of these books seem not to work, whereas yours seem to have worked, both for the reader and for you?
There's a part of me that understands that for the kind of work I do, I need to have some sort of reputational pull that draws people towards me, right? I'm not a used car sales guy. Like, people don't turn up at my lot looking for a car or whatever. And I can't really cold call people and go, you know, that innovation program design, we have the best one for $5.99. I can't do that, right? So the only thing that works for me, and also it's kind of a throwaway comment, but I found it's also beneficial as a person of color. The thing that works for me the most is when people already respect me before we start the conversation. Like, it just makes things so much easier. So I knew I needed to create that reputation. You can do that 2 ways, right? You can be deliberately like snake oil salesman, the reputation. That's why those books don't work in one sense, because it's so obvious what the person is trying to do. They're trying to make a business card book that they can use to open doors so they can say, I wrote a book. Or you can say, I actually have something authentic to share. Let me go to that space and figure out something that's authentic to me, that's true to me, that I've seen in the real world, that I've experienced. So that's what I do. I know I do need to build a reputation, but I don't want to build a reputation on nothing. People then pull back the curtain, they can see substance. So that's what I try to bring into the conversation. And so that's kind of the mix of how I make those decisions.
And you may not have an answer for this, and that's okay. But of the people who have really good intentions, you know, their heart's in the right place, they are trying to share authentically, they're really trying to help their reader, a lot of those books still don't work. They get lost in the noise, or the person puts them out, but it doesn't really help their career. Have you noticed anything? Because you must have seen a lot of people. What do you think they're missing?
I don't know if you know the Intuit story about how they tried to recruit innovation coaches and they failed in their first attempt. Okay, so Intuit tried to recruit innovation coaches, right, to run. They called them innovation catalysts to run this program. And what they did was they said, the thing we're going to do is we're going to get people that are really interested in design thinking and lean startup, and we're going to get those people to become our innovation coaches. So they find these people who've been like to every lean startup conference, people who've like come to your workshop, Rob, and all this stuff, and they read every book 5 times, and they recruited those people and they gave them the role, and the whole thing failed. Like they had the best people, but the whole thing failed. And what they came to the conclusion was, it's not enough to have people that are authentically interested in the topic who are not good teachers. If you're going to recruit a group of innovation coaches and a group of innovation catalysts, they have to have equal interest in teaching. It's almost better to have like somebody who's mediocre at innovation, but a good teacher. Like that probably works better than somebody who's really great at innovation but hates teaching. Of course, you don't want a great teacher who doesn't know anything. But if you can put that together, then, you know. So the question that a lot of authors then face is that, like, have you ever met those people that are like, they're more interested in looking clever than in teaching, right? I think a lot of the problems that a lot of these people have, they have genuinely something to share, but then they spend a lot of time trying to look clever. And I made that mistake. If you ask me the question, I'll tell you the story about how when I was writing the corporate startup, I was making that kind of mistake. And then somebody checked me. One of my readers checked me on that.
I would love to hear that. I had the same experience with the mom test when I sent it out for beta reading. One person, his whole feedback on the book, he goes, I think it's really good, but chapters 2, 3, and 4 are a bit pretentious, aren't they?
I got similar feedback, which was like, the feedback I got was, your blogs are so cool. Your book is so pretentious. Why don't you just write your book in the way you write the blog? Right. And that's because when I'm writing the blog, I'm just like, yeah, man, I had a crappy day today. I met this head of legal and compliance and they told me I had to fill in this form. This is a barrier for innovation because of these things. And here's a hack that you might use to manage those conversations. And then just leave it. Because I'm just sharing, right? It's just like I'm having a conversation. In the book, I would have said, once upon a time, the head of legal and compliance turned up in my office. You know, I was putting this formal tone to it, right? Then because I was writing with Dan Tomai, I got back to Dan, like, this feedback can be powerful. So we started from scratch. Like I rewrote every single word in the conversational tone that I just use in day-to-day life. And that made it much more useful for readers in the end.
How far into the book were you at that point? Presumably months in, if you were already having the manuscript reviewed. So it's a pretty big punch in the gut. Do you think there's a way that mistake was avoidable in advance, or was that just some pain you had to go through to get to the right tone?
I think it was a pain I had to go through, but we were only 3 chapters in.
Okay.
Because our first experiment was a brief description of the book. We recorded a video of the value proposition, and then we put it on this crowdfunding platform called Publishizer. So that was our first experiment. But the deal was that if you were an early adopter, you would get the first 3 chapters early. And so it was in trying to meet that promise that we quickly hacked up these 3 chapters. And we got that feedback that, yeah, sure, I'd rather read your blog than your book. You know, that made us go off and have to start rethinking about how to write that. Yeah. The thing I learned as well when I'm doing public speaking was the more I'm interested in impressing the people I'm talking to, the worse I perform. But the more I'm interested in understanding what they need and just sharing my experiences of how I can help them accomplish what they need, the more I resonate. And so I've stopped worrying about what people think about me instead of worrying about how I can be of use to them. So I think of my keynotes as service. Once you start thinking like that, you become less self-conscious, and then you're also more likely to resonate. Sometimes you'll get it wrong. You'll think you're doing a service, but you're doing a disservice because you didn't really understand the people and what they needed. But at least your goals are a little bit more authentic.
Earlier, you said you need to be a teacher. The book is a teaching product. And for you, I mean, you were teaching at universities, you were doing consulting, you were doing coaching, you had a tremendous library of teaching experiences to draw on. If someone doesn't have that already, how do you think they should approach it? They want to write a book, they think they have something to share. What's the process?
So that's a real struggle, right? Like, I don't want to be disingenuous in giving advice that I don't know anything about in one sense. I can only speak to my experience. And my experience is that I started off teaching quite early in my career. And so I used to suck at teaching. And then over time, you pick up all these techniques and tools of how to explain concepts in ways that work for people. And what ended up happening was I became the statistics teacher at the University of Kent. And after a while of doing the math, my philosophy became, forget about the math, let's just tell stories. When you're trying to do this, it actually means you're trying to make this decision. And the best way to make this decision is to make these kinds of estimates. And the way you can make the estimates is because you use this formula. So it became a way of like navigating people through what they're trying to do and then getting them to the thing rather than saying, use this formula and this is the way it works. And that's my methodology for almost everything. But it's becoming instinctive now. I don't really know how I do it. I just know that's what I do. And it just sort of happens. And then like the stuff goes out into the world and people tell me, no, I don't understand this or that's when I really learn what's working versus what's not working. And then I revise. Right?
You did books with both traditional publishers and also crowdfunded and more by yourself, right? What's your view on it?
I think it's a myth that a traditional publisher can get you more buzz. Oh yeah, you published with this publisher, you published with that publisher. That must have helped. It's like, no, I had to pay for my own promo, travel in the back of the bus myself. Like I had to do everything myself. And so in the end, it's just a label. They don't really even give you that great resource unless you negotiate it up front. And then they take 70% of the money that you're making. And so to one extent, like right these days, I don't even know whether people know who the publisher is. I don't think they care. Like as long as the book arrives and they can read it and it's available wherever they need it to be. So if you want to make money from your business books or whatever books you're writing, practical books, self-publishing is the way to go.
What do people screw up when they try to do it? Or what do they not realize is going to be difficult about the process of taking full responsibility for the book? Because you're basically being your own little business, right? You've got the book as the product, but you're doing the R&D, you're doing the customer understanding, you're figuring out the distribution.
The one that was my sophomore jinx was the Lean Product Lifecycle. It was the second book I wrote. And I was pretty lazy with that book. Like I wasn't really focused on driving value. We just worked on the manuscript. We tested it a little bit. We didn't really do a lot of testing. And then we gave it to the publisher and then the publisher published it. And then they sent us an email going, so what are you doing to promote your book? It's like, wait, you're the publisher. That's the mistake that you make, especially if you have a big publisher. You think that it's enough to write the book and that's what will get you notoriety, etc. But actually writing the book is 50% of the work. And then the rest of the work is making sure that you're creating something of value with a particular tribe of people. I usually like to find a tribe. And then also promoting and making sure that you get resonance and people actually looking for the book when the right time comes.
When you were doing the promotion, had you built an author platform and an audience in advance? What was the way you approached it?
So with the corporate startup, I didn't really have an audience. I think I probably had like 3,000 Twitter followers or something like that. So that's why I was hopping onto your platform, Rob, leveraging your audience, because it's kind of similar space. Alex Osterwalder, Eric Ries, like getting endorsements from those folks, having them allow me to come to their workshops and conferences to speak, et cetera, et cetera. So the official launch of the corporate startup, the book was actually at the Lean Startup Conference in London. And I personally bought with my own money 250 books to give away as a way to jumpstart that. Like I paid for that myself. And so I just stood there and there was a queue and people were coming and I was signing the book and I was giving the book away. I only had to do that once. And after that, then the book started building, momentum. But as someone who was starting out, that was something that I had to do. I don't think you had to do that for the mom test.
I did actually. That's exactly how I got started. It was at Seed Camp Week in London and there were 500 people there. And that was actually what forced me to get it out the door and get it launched. And it's why the early version had so many typos. It was outrageous because Philip Mooring had been one of my beta readers and he really liked the book. And he's like, hey, we're doing this thing if you can get them printed in time. And they basically came up with €2 per book or something just to cover printing costs. So it didn't come straight out of my pocket. It basically broke even. They let me give a little 5-minute one big idea from the book on stage each morning of the conference. So I'd say like, hello, here's one idea. And then there was a pile of books just outside and people picked them up. It was so helpful. We didn't do anything like that for the Workshop Survival Guide, and we're not going to do it for this book. But I think for the right type of book, if there's lots of events, and obviously if you have the network or can build the network, it's so valuable.
Yes.
There's no faster way to get started.
Yeah. And then because after that, then those folks who recommend other people buy the book and you've kind of planted this seed. Of course, if you give away 250 boring books, it might have the negative effect.
I always try to caveat whenever I talk about book marketing. It's like none of this works if the book isn't a good product first.
Yeah, exactly. Because eventually you're literally relying on word of mouth. After that first push, whatever you can do, speak at conferences or whatever, you're then relying on word of mouth. You have nothing else to go on. People have to be saying, oh yeah, I use the corporate startup in my work. Here's the book. And they keep telling that to other people. So
Did you explicitly endorse or make life easier for trainers, consultants, the people who might be teaching and distributing the book on your behalf, or was it fully organic? Like, did you create teaching materials, slide decks, worksheets, all of that stuff?
So for the corporate startup, we had worksheets and stuff. We created like a website where we put like downloadable worksheets that were from the book, innovation thesis guides, etc. But we didn't do anything for trainers. I don't think my book worked well for that. They're more strategy type. They don't work well on the trainer side, but we did the downloadable sheets. But the majority of it was. I don't even know because we don't really track how many downloads we got there. But
yeah, it's so hard to get good analytics for books. No matter how hard you try on your own website, Amazon's just, well, I've got 80% of it, and I'm not telling you what happens.
Exactly. And here's your check.
Yeah. I met up with Alex Osterwalder around a Lean Camp London through Salim Barani, probably back in, it must have been 2008, 2010. Yeah. And we were having drinks at this little kind of sake Japanese whiskey bar. And I still hadn't written my first book yet. And Alex Osterwalder, just offhandedly, he said such a meaningful thing to me. He says, you know why most business books fail? Because the authors are too in love with writing. But people don't buy business books for the writing. They buy business books for the outcome. Yes. And so then he started talking about, like, we wanted as few words as possible. That's why we went so heavy with the images. We wanted, you can open it on any 2 pages and get an idea. It was so mind-changing. That was probably the moment I started to think about nonfiction as a product instead of as literature.
Yes. And you can imagine my inferiority complex when I finally turned up, instead of working with him day to day. And I'm just like, man, the way they do this, my stuff is, I suck. So what they do, it's the most fascinating process you'll ever see. Like him and Eve, it's visuals first, no words. So they do visuals, they draw, then they test the drawings at conferences, see if people are nodding along and agreeing. Wow. Then they test them in workshops, and then they run crazy amounts of experiments on the visuals. Then once they have the visuals and the structure and the flow and everything, they go, okay, so how are we going to explain this? Then they start putting as little words as possible to sort of make that work. And that's why those books are so useful. And they have the principle of the spread, which is if you open a spread, there's value per spread. Value per spread. And so that's how they structure it.
It was such a shift from the way that books are normally written. It was innovation on both sides of the business model canvas, because they were changing what the product was, but they were also changing how they made it. It's so cool. And what about co-authors? This question came straight from the community, because a lot of people wonder, it's a long and lonely road to write a book by yourself, but also doing it with someone else is no picnic. You've done it both ways. Do you have any view?
Co-authorship is hard because sometimes you put strains on friendships that you then have to rebuild after. As you discuss, like what should go in the book, what shouldn't go in the book, who's doing the heavy lifting, who isn't doing the heavy lifting. There's never such a thing as an equal partnership on anything, right? Like if it's a business or whatever, there's always somebody doing more. And the question is, how comfortable are you with that? And also, what do you do when you disagree and then you have to commit and all that? So there's a lot of relationship management that happens when you're writing a book together. So the question then becomes, is the amount of relationship management and coordination and making sure you stay friends worth the value that you get from working together? And in both circumstances, I found that it was, but it's something that you just have to be really aware of, because it's actually more emotional than people think.
With Devin and I, it worked really well because we also had a business together. And so it didn't really matter who was spending more time on the book because we also shared the business. And so if someone was doing less on the book, they were doing more on the business and vice versa.
Right.
Without that, I think it gets a lot more challenging. And to be honest, I've even struggled writing like a section with a co-author, right, without that kind of background of the shared business.
Exactly. It's like, Devin, where are you? I'm in Cabo. What are you doing over there? Come back. We got a chapter to finish. Yeah, what that does is it takes away the emotional toll of, I'm just doing this all myself, whatever that feeling that you get. You guys are lucky in that. Also, because you have a business together, you work together all the time. So you've got a working relationship, right? Whereas sometimes co-authors don't. They just sort of met or maybe did some collaboration before, and now they think, oh, maybe it's better if we write a book together or whatever, right?
It's not so easy. And it's long also. Like people's lives change over the year or two that you're writing the book. And sometimes people's availability or constraints or goals or whatever can shift. So you're also dealing with this moving target.
Yes, absolutely. That's the thing is you see 2 co-author names in a book and you think, oh yeah, they wrote a book together. But actually what you don't see in the background is that there was a relationship to manage. And it's that stuff that's much more emotional and personal. And so that's just what you need to pay attention to.
If someone was starting from scratch, Is there the most applicable kind of marketing or get it out there tactic that you think would apply to most authors? And what's the right time to start it? Is it when you have the idea? Where in the process do you begin getting it out there?
It's a chicken and egg question for me, which is, can you write a book without a little bit of an audience? If you had zero audience, if you had nobody who follows you, you've never given a keynote, you have like 20 Twitter followers, 2 LinkedIn connections, your website is 12 subscribers, could you write a successful book from that standing start? There's 2 parts to that, right? You have to be thinking about the value you want to create and who you want to create that value for. And then the next question is, well, where are those people and how do you reach them? That's something you have to actively think about. And then what I would do is I would use the process of writing the book as a process of acquiring those people. So like as I create content, bits and pieces of content, I would be using it, putting it into those spaces where those people exist and really asking for feedback and creating interactions. And I think that creative interactions will build a following and build an interest. I did it organically, right? I was just blogging and hanging out with you and talking and all these links to other events and just doing my Tendayi thing. I used to be a rapper or whatever. So I would say if you're really going from a standing start, then you do need this combination of leveraging whatever you're writing as a way to start building momentum. So that by the time you get to the end of writing the book, then you've already got like at least some runway just to start sort of launching it with. Yeah.
That's exactly what Arvid Kahl did with his first book. And he said that while he was writing it, just as he wrote each section, he would just share them. Like the section would also be a blog post and he'd read it out loud on his podcast and all of this stuff. And over the year of writing, his audience went from 300 Twitter followers to 8,000. And he built a newsletter up to several thousand people from scratch just by basically repurposing the stuff he was already doing. It's such an obvious idea. And I can't believe I didn't think of it. It's like a book is made out of blog posts. They're not exactly the same, but it's like a cow is made out of meat or a tree is made out of lumber. You can like harvest,
exactly
the marketing material out of it.
And we talk about how hard it is to write books, but we forget how hard it is to read books. And so before you read a book, you want some signal that you're going to get value from it. And there's no better signal than somebody recommending the book for you to say, this is the book that we want to read.
What have you noticed now that you've been through it and you kind of know how a good book is created? Do you get driven crazy reading business books now?
And it's gotten worse since I joined Strategizer, right? So now I'm just like, oh, this is so boring. Like, get to the point already. Like, I've been reading for like 10 pages and I don't know what we're talking about. I used to think when I first started writing books that if you get to the point too quickly, people will think that you're cheating them. I used to think that you needed words to make it a book. Right. But actually, people don't think that. In fact, the shorter the book, the better. If you can have like a book that you can grab a croissant and a coffee in Starbucks whenever they open and sit there for 4 hours and you're like 80% through and you've gotten maximum value. Like those books are the best. They're like really just short, useful books for a specific thing.
I get so mad. I read books now. I'm just like, why are you doing this? You don't need to make me read all of this. What about the credibility question? Because I think this is what slows first-time authors down. They feel the imposter syndrome. They feel like no one knows who they are, and they feel like they need to justify themselves and their knowledge. And this seems to be where a lot of the introductory fluffiness comes from. Let me tell you my story. Let me convince you I'm credible. Meanwhile, the reader's getting more and more bored. So it's having the opposite effect that it was intended for.
Yes.
Do you have a view on the credibility, the imposter syndrome?
This is advice that I give to people in Pirates in the Navy, my book, because a lot of innovators spend a lot of time with PowerPoint presentations trying to convince leaders that they're credible innovators. Do you know the best way to build credibility? Just create value. Bam. I open the first book, value. Oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. Second page, value. Bam. Oh, wow. Bam. Value. By the time they've gone through like half your book, you're actually credible. You don't have to tell me that you were born in San Francisco and then you grew up at the Bay and then you went to this place. And then when I was sitting in the tree, that's when I discovered peace or whatever. I already have the book.
Yeah, right. They paid for.
Yeah, like what you wanted me to do, I've already done. I took money out of my pocket and I put the like I can't do anything more for you now. Just start giving me the value. Whatever you did to get that foot through the door, once your foot is through that door, stop talking about how hard it is to get your foot through the door. Just start creating value. And as you start creating more and more value, your credibility builds up, and then you have to do less and less heavy lifting as you sort of move through.
Having worked with the team at Strategizer, as you say, they're the big leagues of books. Are you going to do anything differently if you sat down to write another one? Do you think in retrospect, there were mistakes that you made in your books?
I wanted to have an authentic writing style and write with my own voice and share my experiences. But I was also quite impatient because I was desperate to put something out that I can leverage for reputation building. But now that I'm here, I think I bought myself a little bit of a runway to really deliberately think about crafting something that is tested and iterated and built up over time that creates more value. So I think with my next piece of work, I'm going to be much more deliberate with using everything, that all the pieces that I've learned, I'm going to now much more deliberately follow the kind of the systematic process of creating that content. The first principles, they become self-evident. And then the only question now is the distance between you hearing those principles and having the discipline to use them as you write, because you then have other pressures, right? You want to put out the book, you have deadlines, you have family. Can you really get up in the morning? What does feedback feel like to you when you receive it in terms of emotions and all this stuff? That's the stuff that you then have to get over.
It's hard, especially the first beta reader. I feel like this is the biggest time-wasting trap in writing. You're like, oh, it's still so bad. And you know it's bad, but you need the feedback to make it good. But you're like, I'll just rewrite it once more.
Exactly.
And certainly you don't want to send them the complete first draft, but also it's not going to be polished. There's all these little traps. It's so emotionally loaded. And then you're like, whoops, well, that cost me 3 months.
Here's an interesting experience that I observed with Alex Osterwald. Do you know what makes him really pissed? It's people who send him polished first drafts of anything. He's just like, it's too polished. Now if I tell you feedback, I'm hurting your feelings. So if we're working on anything, whether it's a slide deck or design of a course, it's like, go on the whiteboard, send me the 5 sticky structure, and that's all I want. But it's hard to do that at work. Like, people have spent their whole life in jobs succeeding by doing great work. And now you're telling them that they have to send you their worst work. But after a while, you learn that it's actually more important to be directionally correct rather than like precisely in the details correct. So that's what that first beta test is for. It's like, am I heading in the right direction? It's like driving to Birmingham, right? If the signs are saying Dublin 20 miles, you know you're going in the wrong direction, but you're not going to be like, I don't want to look at the signs. I'm just going to keep driving. Like, that's really what that is. And I think your greatest fear should be like investing all of that time and then turning out that you were like heading in the wrong, like nobody cares. It's the worst feeling. Like, people end up not writing a second book after that because that's heartbreaking.
This is why I bang on so much about the desirability of the promise when picking the reader profile. Do they want it? If they don't want it, it does not matter how beautifully you write it.
It's also hard to predict which things resonate versus which things don't resonate while you're writing, because things you might think resonate with you don't resonate with the audience. You have to be putting your stuff out as early and as quickly as possible and getting that feedback and then incorporating it back into what you're writing.
I've been absolutely shocked by how little I can predict what people are going to like. It's not the exact opposite of what I think, but I always miss their favorite parts or they surprise me. And I always think that what they're going to absolutely love is just like 0 comments. No one even wants to comment on it because they're just embarrassed for me. They just have to skip it and pretend they didn't see it.
You know what's the worst? Is there's not even a correlation with effort. That's what's most heartbreaking about writing, is you could spend hours crafting something and get nothing. And you could write something on a deadline because you have to put it out and put it out with mistakes, right? That's what you did. And then it resonates. That lack of correlation with effort is, that for me has always been the hardest, because you get socialized that the more effort you get, the more results you get. But not with creative things. It's really hard.
The value for the reader, not the suffering from the artist, or the author. Is there anything that you think is the essential advice or the big mistake that people make that they got to know about or got to pay attention to?
There's 2 things, which is, number one is, if it's a nonfiction book, it has to be useful for something. So who is it useful for? And what are they going to use it for? And what outcomes are they trying to create? And then you have to ask yourself, every time you put a word in there, is this helping get to that outcome? Or is this just helping me feel good that I'm writing? And that is the amount of self-reflection that you need to have to do that. I think we forget that it's people that write books, like it's a personal thing. And so the amount of self-analysis that you have to do. Am I really creating value? Do I really need to add this piece to this person gave me feedback? Is this great feedback? Am I resisting it because of my ego? There's so much humanity in writing, and it takes the emotional toll of that. If people tend to disregard. And every author should just always remember that and really steel yourself for that, because the creative process is that, right? It's ups and downs.
And where can people find out more about you, learn from you, or help you? Where's the right place for them to find you?
Yeah, tendayiviki.com, my name, and then .com. That's the right place to find me. Thank you, Rob. Fitz. Thank you, Devin.